Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 250, and this time I'm going to talk about Keith Jarrett's magnificent record from 1975 on ECM Records, the Cologne Concert. And this is, I think, a 1978 US repress. I mean, you really can't go wrong with ECM original releases and represses in general. The quality is very good, and I have no complaints about this. Jarrett is best known for a long, productive streak as a leader in the 1970s and arguably into the 1980s. A lot of great albums for Impulse, but most of his best work has been done for ECM. And it was with ECM that he nudged the jazz universe off its axis in the 1970s by introducing a largely new approach, unaccompanied and entirely improvised solo piano concerts. Keith Jarrett was born May 8, 1945 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was a child prodigy. He started on piano before he turned 3. His first TV appearance was when he was 5 years old, and by 7, he was doing recitals both of classical composers but also performing his own compositions. In the early 60s, despite opportunities to move to Europe to pursue a classical career, he decides to focus on jazz, and after he graduates from high school in 1963, he moves to Boston to attend the Berklee College of Music. However, as is the case with a lot of innovators, Jarrett finds that he's got more to offer the music world than formal training has to offer him. So a year later, at age 19, he moves to New York to start playing jazz in Greenwich Village clubs. Pretty soon he's hired by Art Blakey, who was always looking for young talent. That lasts about 4 months. Jarrett doesn't really like the vibe, doesn't like the schedule. He does appear on one record with the Jazz Messengers, though, which is Buttercorn Lady. Soon after he leaves Blakey, the drummer Jack DeJohnette introduces him to the saxophonist Charles Lloyd, who was leading a very exciting, frankly cutting-edge quartet. Jarrett joins Lloyd and stays with that quartet for the middle part of the 1960s, releasing some great records, including the well-known Forest Flower, recorded live at Monterey. The Lloyd Quartet was quite a big thing in its day, capitalizing on the psychedelia mood in the general environment of pop music. And while they were quite experimental, they also were quite accessible, and Jarrett found himself, along with the rest of the quartet, enjoying a significant following amongst pop and rock fans as well as jazz fans. In the later 1960s, Jarrett begins to record his own albums as a leader, beginning a productive collaboration that would last for many years with Charlie Hayden, the bassist, and Paul Motion, the drummer, who of course had played on those fantastic Bill Evans sets. Jarrett's debut as a leader, Life Between the Exit Signs, comes out in 1967. It's a terrific record, if a little bit raw, but you'd expect something that good when you've got 3 individual players of that quality in a small group setting. He then switches gears and makes quite an unusual record called Restoration Ruin, on which he doesn't play the piano at all, although he does play 11 other instruments, mostly string instruments and percussion. It's not a jazz record, unless you really want to stretch the definition. It's more of a folk, rock, country rock kind of record. Not necessarily the most brilliant thing he ever did, but very interesting. He was still at this point with the Charles Lloyd Quartet, but that group had kind of run its course by 1968. And so when that group wound up, Jarrett and DeJohnette both joined Miles Davis at what was the start of his electric phase. He finds it hugely influential in terms of Miles's approach to improvisation, but he doesn't play the acoustic piano. He ends up playing the electric piano and the organ, and quite rapidly Jarrett fell out of love with playing electric instruments, which he would subsequently refer to as toys. Jarrett ends up leaving Miles in the latter part of 1971, but he kept on playing with Hayden and Motion, and as a trio or quartet, they released a whole bunch of great records around this time. The Morning of a Star, El Juicio, Birth. When they functioned as a quartet, they would bring in the tenor saxophonist Dewey Redman, and with Redman they made something like a dozen records, most of those for Impulse. More significant developments that would really affect Jarrett's career had been going on in the background, however, with the foundation of ECM Records by the German producer Manfred Eicher. Jarrett was hugely impressed with Eicher's commitment to the quality of the music and the quality of the recording above and beyond any commercial considerations, and so he was not a hard sell to sign to the label. Jarrett and his American quartet began to record on ECM, albums like The Survivor's Suite and Eyes of the Heart. And beginning in 1972, thanks to connections that Eicher had made for him, Jarrett begins to develop a European quartet with the saxophonist Jan Garbarek, Palle Danielson on bass, and John Christensen on drums. Both of these quartets ended up recording a large amount of work which was at the same time avant-garde and yet still very accessible, and importantly distinct from the funk and R&B fusion efforts happening elsewhere. However, despite the significant body of work I've already described, what really changes the game in 1973 is when he starts doing these solo concerts which are completely improvised. These concerts were, for the time, highly innovative and highly courageous. They involved Jarrett playing for an hour or more, deliberately avoiding any prior music, and deliberately, consciously avoiding even having the most basic sketches in mind when he sat down to play. They were created from scratch. The first of these to be released on vinyl was a pair of concerts he played in 1973, one in Bremen and one in Lausanne, which Time magazine awarded its Jazz Album of the Year. The follow-up release in this series, this record, is, as the title suggests, taken from a concert in Cologne, Germany, and the events surrounding this performance are a story in themselves. Over the winter of 1974-75, Keith Jarrett played a series of 24 concerts, beginning in the United States, ending in the United States, with an 11-concert run in Europe in the middle of that. On January 24, 1975, he was booked into the Cologne Opera House, and the promoter for that concert was a teenager, a 17-year-old girl called Vera Brandes. In general, Jarrett and his manager Manfred Eicher, who was also his producer and the owner of ECM Records, have been quite careful to schedule this tour to leave at least one rest day in between performances. But when Brandes called and said she could get the Cologne Opera House, they felt this was too good an opportunity to miss. So he played the night before in Switzerland, and then they drove all morning to get to Cologne. So they arrive exhausted at the hotel. Brandes meets them at the hotel, and they go together to check out the venue. The problem is, Jarrett had asked, and Brandes had promised, a Bosendorfer grand piano, a 9-foot-long piano, to play on. What was there, because the opera house staff apparently had screwed up, was a Bosendorfer, but it wasn't a grand piano, it was a baby grand. And what's worse, it was out of tune, some of the keys were not responsive, and the pedals were sticky. So Jarrett says, look, I can't play on this, and he and Eicher head back to the hotel, and Brandes now has to face the shame and humiliation and financial problems of canceling the concert. So she rushes back to the hotel, and right there on the curb in the pouring rain is pleading with Jarrett, can he please come and play the concert notwithstanding? And he can't turn down this poor waif who's pleading, soaking wet, and he says, never forget, only for you. So he agrees to play the concert. That's all very gallant, but now he's got to perform, and the problems continue to pile up. In addition to being exhausted and in a back brace, he can't find a decent hot meal before the time of the concert. In this state, he had to change his approach due to the condition of the piano. He had to play louder in order to be able to reach this big hall. He had to confine himself to the middle part of the keyboard, and because the pedals weren't working, he had to rely on rhythm and syncopation to inject dynamism into the performance. So out of all of this, out of his physical condition, out of the condition of the piano, out of his basic exhaustion, comes a remarkable performance. Part one of the performance occupies the first side of the first record, and in this performance you can hear multitudes. There's Gershwin, there's gospel, there's these funky ostinatos, there's groans, there's shouts, there's foot stomps. But mostly what you can hear are some fairly simple rhythms played in his left hand and some remarkable, ethereal, technically brilliant runs using the right. Through most of the record, this is the dominant feeling. A few chords in the left hand and all kinds of different things happening with the right. Sometimes more classical feeling, sometimes more gospel-y or bluesy, sometimes really urgent and repetitive, but always fascinating and, again, just flowing out of his head as it comes. Sides 2 and 3 are the same piece of music, basically split in half to fit the requirements of vinyl. This is a more up-tempo piece, at least initially, and then about 8 minutes in, it moves into a much slower piece, which is not really reverent, it's more kind of ominous. That builds in intensity. When you get into side 3, you get this really urgent-seeming rhythm. And what I found myself relating to, because as a Zeppelin fan, and a big one, I have listened to ridiculous numbers of hours of Zeppelin bootlegs, is if you're familiar at all with how Zeppelin would play no quarter in concert, where it would extend up to half an hour, and most of the spotlight shines on John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones's piano improvisations, not of the same caliber as Jarrett's, I hasten to add, are clearly, I think, influenced by this, which shows just how far-reaching, I think, Jarrett's influence was in the music world in the mid-70s. You may think this is silly, but don't flame me. Listen to their gigs in Vancouver in the spring of 1975 before you say I'm wrong. The last side is called Part 2C, which sounds like it's the third part of what had occupied sides 2 and 3. In fact, it's the encore. It's an entirely separate piece of music. It's the most poppy and upbeat of all the music on this record. It's almost, I would say, verging into adult contemporary. The magic of Keith Jarrett's solo work stems largely from the background of the man himself. The diversity of his musical training, of his musical taste, of his musical experience means that he has enormous amounts to draw on. Classical, hard bop, jazz fusion, avant-garde. It is serious music, it's listening music, but it's also at the same time, funnily enough, music that you can daydream to. In jazz terms, if so far you've been marinating in, the hard bop sauce of Blue Notes releases from the 1960s and you want to spread your wings a little bit, I don't think there's any better entry into ECM's catalog than this record. It's a classic, it's a headphone special, and for me it's 5 out of 5 stars.